Welcome back to yet again another episode of History of Gaming Metal Gear. To let you know that this is a restream of an already played part of this series, as I mentioned in previous episodes here on the YouTube or Twitch channel. We did lose content for Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake and Metal Gear Solid 1. If you're watching this episode, that means you just finished watching the Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake restreams. That is the second time we played it on stream, but because we lost those videos, it's the first time you see it on YouTube. So to continue on, today we are starting up Metal Gear Solid. Restreaming this, of course, so what you'll be seeing today is the technical review of Metal Gear Solid 1 on the PlayStation 1. And then, to enjoy the entire story in its entirety, we'll be playing the GameCube version of Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes. I hope you guys enjoy this. This is probably one of the most enjoyable games to sit back and play, so I'm not too upset to have to replay this, let's be frank. So let's begin with the history lesson. And to start the history lesson, of course, we always have to start off with Hideo Kojima and what he was doing at the time. With Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake released, Kojima continues his career with Konami. He works on a re-release version of Snatcher, and then produces yet another fan-favorite game called Policenauts. Policenauts is released in 1994 for the NEC PC-9821. I bet everybody had one of those in their house, right? This was a home computer system, primarily sold in Japan. This title, Policenauts, will also see a port to the 3DO, PlayStation 1, and Sega Dreamcast by the year 1996, so 2 years later. This is where the game catches a lot of its popularity and fandom. Kojima considers this to be his most exhaustive piece of singular work, stating that Metal Gear is his epic movie series, while Policenauts is his featured film. I think that it's interesting that we continue to see Hideo take this movie producer approach to video games, which makes him so ideally unique to the video game industry. All projects after Metal Gear 2 that Kojima worked on were mostly for disc-based systems. This allows for voice acting to be present within the works, and I feel that Kojima felt this was a necessary element to video games, considering his approach from a movie director standpoint. We begin seeing this voice work starting here in Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation 1. It's shortly after this that voice acting becomes more of a mainstay and a requirement in gaming, but Metal Gear Solid was definitely one of the first games to have full voice acting. There's very, very little text, and off the top of my head I can't think of any, to be quite frank, that isn't voiced. Shortly after the release of Metal Gear Solid 1 in 1998, Hideo Kojima becomes an international celebrity amongst gamers. It's no longer a name in the credits that who the hell made this moment has happened. And it's now happening to gamers across the world, and they're researching and finding out who this man is and talking about him. Catching a lot of love for it. So let's talk about the game itself. Metal Gear Solid 1998. Initially, Hideo Kojima had planned to release a third Metal Gear game under the title Metal Gear 3. This would have been for the 3DO platform and released in 1994. Luckily, Kojima was noticing the dwindling support for the 3DO and elected to move its development, Metal Gear's development, to the PlayStation just after he releases Policenauts for the 3DO. So he was actively working with the 3DO and saw some things he didn't like, but then saw some things he did like for PlayStation. So that is why we luckily ended up with the PlayStation 1 version of Metal Gear Solid and not a 3DO version. In doing this, Kojima decided it would be best to rename the game as Metal Gear Solid. This was based off his belief that the first two MSX titles were widely unknown at the time, and in his own words, Solid has three meanings: a reference to Solid Snake, the game's use of 3D graphics, and Konami's rivalry with Square. So basically, why do we go from Metal Gear to Metal Gear Solid? Well, the two MSX2 titles You know, people don't really know about it. So instead of calling it 3 and then making people go back and look for Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 on the MSX, he's just calling it Metal Gear Solid, and it's starting a new series. Nobody's feeling left out to pick up the game and run with it from here. And then additionally, I think most obvious, he thinks this game is Solid, so he calls it Solid. And of course it has to do with Solid Snake, right? Development for this game began in 1995 and finishing after a 3-year development period in 1998. This time was mostly spent making the game as realistic as possible, as Kojima was quoted to have said multiple times, "If the player isn't tricked into believing this world is real, then there's no point in making the game." All characters were created and designed by Kojima, then modified by a conceptual artist, Yoji Shinkawa, and then completed by a polygonal artist using pencil drawings and clay models completed by Shinkawa. Interesting enough, this is where the practice of using Lego pieces to design levels and play out scenes for the game started. This is hilariously enough still how Kojima does things today. If you take a look at his Twitter account, you'll see that in his most recent development for Death Stranding, which at the time of the making of this video has not been released yet, the Death Stranding trailer that he showed at the most recent E3 that people were losing their minds over, he originally planned out using Legos. It was very, very interesting. I love that he uses something so simple to plan out such amazing scenes. Some functions Kojima was striving for Metal Gear Solid were not able to be accomplished, but we see them return in later titles. Such thing as massive object interaction, and in his words, a feature called Full Orchestra right next to the player, meaning a system which could dynamically change the music score based on the events within the game. Doesn't that sound a whole lot like a movie and how they would handle a scene? It does to me. It is important to note that this is the era when gaming starts going into big promotional efforts, and Metal Gear Solid was definitely part of a new trend. The promotional cost for this game came to $8 million. Just the promotional cost was $8 million, and this is back in the 90s. Metal Gear Solid was released on September 3rd, 1998, for the PlayStation, earning a Metacritic score of 94% and selling over 6 million copies worldwide. Finally, as we always compare each game to other titles that released the same year, we will do so now, but I do have to admit 1998 was an intensely amazing year in video game history. And unlike the two previous titles, Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2, I feel that MGS here ranks highly and holds its own, but does not dominate all other games out at the time, like previously had happened. And that is really saying something, because the following titles are quite legendary. Starting with StarCraft and its Brood War expansion came out in 1998, Banjo-Kazooie, Resident Evil 2, Tomb Raider 3, Fallout 2, Baldur's Gate, and then these two games, I don't know, maybe you guys have heard of them, Half-Life and Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Just the sheer fact that Ocarina of Time and Metal Gear Solid 1 come out in the same year, 1998 is going to be a hard year for gaming to beat in general. So that is Metal Gear Solid 1 for the PlayStation 1. We'll be doing a technical review for that here in just the next episode. But let's go ahead and talk about the version of the game that we'll be playing in its entirety, and that is Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes. Now, this will be a very short look at the development of Twin Snakes, as it is just a remastering of Metal Gear Solid, and it is kind of out of the timeline of what we're talking about here. We now jump all the way up to the 2000s. It's not mind-blowingly interesting or crazy, but we'll cover it nonetheless. In 2002, Nintendo invited Konami to create a Metal Gear game for the Nintendo GameCube. Kojima agreed, but felt it should be a remake and not an all-new game. Additionally, most of Konami and Kojima's development teams were busy on other projects at the time, so another studio would have to be found to do the work. Kojima felt the staff should not have to repeat their own work there at Konami. They had no experience with the GameCube as well, and they were already working on Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater at this time. Therefore, on May 1st of 2003, Nintendo officially announced that the remake would happen, being Metal Gear Solid 1, and that Silicon Knights would be working on the game. The game would utilize graphic engines to make it appear as good as Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, which was already released at the time of the launch of Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes. To ensure its success, both Hideo Kojima and Shigeru Miyamoto would oversee the development. Two legendary names touching the same project. It's just beautiful. It was not only graphically and gameplay improvements that we saw here, but it was intended to bring more to Twin Snakes. A high-quality cutscenes were to be added as well, and to do this, they excitingly brought on Ryohei Kitamura, and he directed these new cutscenes in his signature style. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Kitamura's work, he is a very well-known Japanese and mostly horror filmmaker with an incredible eye for camera angles, and we'll see that in the Twin Snakes remake of Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes was released on the 9th of March 2004 for the Nintendo GameCube and earned a Metacritic score of 85%. Sadly, the game did not sell well and only made it, not even making it to 1 million copies, which is considered successful or not successful. That 1 million mark's kind of the line in the sand for game development. But later, it became a hard-to-find favorite among fans. And it's gone up in price and a lot of rarity and sought-afterness for Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes. Lastly, a very exciting tidbit of information. In March of 2017, so just last year, Dennis Dyack, the former president of Silicon Knights, stated there is a good likelihood, and I'm quoting him here, a good likelihood of Metal Gear Solid the Twin Snakes being re-released for the Nintendo Switch. Now, we'll see what happens. You know, there's no promises there, but God, wouldn't that be exciting? I would absolutely adore that. So, with that being said, I'll close up this introduction to the game, and then we'll take it over to the technical review on the next episode for Metal Gear Solid 1 PlayStation 1.